That's part of what a lot of the civil unrest in Israel is about, is that a lot of people do care about the hostages and think that the government needs to stop the war and focus on getting the hostages back and not killing innocent civilians. So that
I wonder about that last part. I wonder if the Israeli body politic.
Oh, you think the Israelis want civilians to die? There were massive demonstrations in Israel, tens of thousands of people in a country that's relatively small. So I think characterizing like the majority of the public as wanting to kill civilians is a little sick, personally.
Ethan Klein appears to harbor contradictions. In his recent conversation with Sam Cedar of the Majority Report, he claims to have optimism with regard to Israeli society. Israelis do not wish death on Palestinian civilians. He claims this is evident in the protests in Israel for the end of hostilities in Gaza. Though in more casual conversation, he not only tolerates but appears to share a more jaded outlook.
The thing is, in Ramallah, there's a lot of, there's going to be like Hamas operatives and Islamic jihadists and stuff that live there. So I don't even know necessarily if it's like the ordinary people, but yeah, they will kill you.
I just got out of the bathroom. What did I miss?
Whether sincere or not, I found his incredulousness at the notion of Israeli society supporting the killing of Palestinian civilians interesting. Following October 7th, what Americans could glean from reactions inside Israel to the carnage in Gaza was no less than completely horrifying. Members of the Knesset called for nuking Gaza. A prominent general wrote opinion pieces calling for inducing epidemics of disease and making the strip uninhabitable. Israel's finance minister shared the article and expressed his agreement. Israelis took to social media to mock Palestinians, gloating over their running water and electricity, which was cut off to Gaza. Though, for some reason, I held on to an assumption that these were narrow and incomplete glimpses into Israeli society. I suppose I had an optimistic view that Israelis would surely harbor a capacity for empathy with Palestinians, to some degree. What I saw in the spring of 2024 was therefore a gut punch. It was a report from Pew Research Center titled, "Israeli Views of the Israel-Hamas War." I read it carefully, and a figure leaped out at me. Israeli Arabs, Palestinians, are much more likely than Jews to say the country's military response has gone too far. 74% versus 4%. Honestly, reading it now, I still can't believe it. And for that, I feel incredibly naive. I guess it fundamentally altered what I believed about humanity, about people. It was genuinely, horribly depressing. For me, it was a sign of the damage that's been done and the work that is ahead. Or maybe there are other ways to interpret it. It certainly was not a moment of optimism for me. Already in December of 2023, Human Rights Watch reported the Israeli government is using starvation of civilians as a method of warfare in the Gaza Strip, which is a war crime. Israeli forces are deliberately blocking the delivery of water, food, and fuel. By the new year, the images of destruction in Gaza were no less than apocalyptic, as we all clearly remember as it was widely reported. Owing to a bombing campaign that you'd have to go back to the Vietnam War to make a comparison, in the words of Mark Garlasco, who's frequently interviewed by news outlets for his unique expertise in weapons. He worked for U.S. intelligence, the United Nations, and Human Rights Watch, for which he investigated Israel's 2006 bombing of Lebanon. Other quotes from experts were similarly astonishing. In 2 months, we've had about the level of strikes in this tiny little area in Gaza as what we saw in Mosul and Raqqa combined, said Larry Lewis, research director at the Center for Naval Analyses and formerly the U.S. State Department's senior advisor on civilian harm. Even CNN in this article placed the number of killed as of January 2024 at nearly 25,000. 1 year after October 7th, many more tens of thousands had been killed. The number couldn't possibly be known for certain. A credible study from The Lancet, reported by the New York Times, said many tens of thousands more than the oft-cited but conservative Ministry of Health numbers. Gaza had been so destroyed that even the U.S. president was calling it a
demolition site. It's a pure demolition site.
But protests had erupted in Israel to end the so-called war. Real quick, why do I say so-called war? In Gaza, we certainly haven't seen regular warfare, obviously. Hamas has no regular army. But we've hardly seen what can be called an asymmetric conflict. It's important to note that numberless Gazans have bravely resisted the Israeli military despite unimaginable and impossible odds, including the following. The Palestinians in Gaza have been hermetically sealed inside without any way out. They have no peripheral sanctuary state for which to regroup and rearm themselves. They are completely trapped. They've had to dig tunnels going underground to find a sanctuary. This, in a strip of land the size of Philadelphia, that also holds an entire civilian population. Of course, the existence of this small strip is a result of the Nakba, as some 70% of the population are not from Gaza, but are refugees from the ethnic cleansing that took place, particularly in the cleansing operations, that's what they were called, in Isdud, Ascalon, Beersheba, and throughout the Negev. So, Gazans are fighting from a place that is in no way conducive for combat, for reasons completely out of their control. The Israeli onslaught that began on October 7th was a culmination of lessons learned in previous destruction. We can clearly see how the so-called wars of 2008 and 9 and 2014 were punitive rather than driven by military necessity. Tank crews spent their time firing their cannons at buildings and destroying civilian infrastructure, said a soldier who took part in the 2008-9 Operation Cast Lead. Go ahead and ask soldiers how often they encountered combatants in Gaza. Nothing. The interviewer, when you entered the Gaza Strip, there was no resistance? Next to none at all. Following Cast Lead, veteran defense analyst Amos Harel quoted a squad leader who said, "The atmosphere in general, from what I understood from most of my men who I talked to, the lives of Palestinians, let's say, is something very, very less important than the lives of our soldiers." The Independent quoted a junior officer who served at a brigade headquarters during the operation, who described the new rules of engagement policy following the announcement of the notorious Dahia doctrine of disproportionality as one of literally zero risk to soldiers. Just take this incredible interview with a bulldozer operator. Our objective was to demolish houses. We were secured by heavy armored personnel carriers and tanks. In this case, the tanks were assigned to us rather than the other way around. The area was completely empty. Everything was empty. Interviewer, ghost town, not a soul in sight? Yes. We demolished a lot. There were people who had been in Gaza for 2 days constantly demolishing one house after the other. And we're talking about a whole battalion. In a separate interview, a soldier is asked, "Did you happen to escort bulldozers demolishing houses? Do you know what they destroyed? Why? How many?" If they didn't like the looks of some house, if it disturbed or threatened them, then it would be taken down. Interviewer, but that was for operational needs? Operational needs, I don't know, maybe half of them. Sometimes the company commander would give the D9 something to demolish just to make them happy. This isn't to mention the demolition and damage carried out by shelling. One participant of the 2014 carnage, a first sergeant of the engineering corps, said, "I got the impression that every house we passed on our way got hit by a shell, and houses farther away too. It was methodical. There was no threat. They were spraying every house with machine gun fire the whole time, and once in a while blasting a shell into each house." A first sergeant in the armored corps recalls, "We were all firing a lot when there wasn't any need for it, just for the sake of firing. We were firing purposelessly, all day long. Hamas was nowhere to be seen." This can hardly be called warfare. These were brief, one-sided punishment campaigns. Israeli civilian and military commanders seemingly acknowledge this with their oft-repeated phrase, "mowing the lawn" or "cutting the grass," which also alludes to its routine nature. Yosi Glausius explains the phrase very helpfully in a rage-filled opinion article. She had seen eclairs in a bakery in Israel that read, "Let the IDF mow them down." The Hebrew word written on the eclairs means mow, as in to lawn mow, but mowing is also a euphemism for something more brutal. Mowing the grass is a term popularized in 2013 to refer to Israel's strategy of attrition designed primarily to debilitate the enemy capabilities. To put it more crudely, mowing the grass means bombing Gaza periodically to facilitate temporary quiet for Israel. This desire to punish the civilian population at large was explicitly articulated, and the policy solidified following Israel's strategic defeat in the Second Lebanon War. Giora Island is former national security advisor to Ariel Sharon and Ehud Olmert. Before this, he was head of the IDF's planning and operations branches. He now continues writing policy prescriptions in opinion pieces, particularly for Ynet and their affiliated Yediot Aharonot. You'll know his so-called general's plan to starve North Gaza. He's the general.
Surrender or to die in starvation. This is the all simple plan, which is fully consistent with all the international demands and fully consistent with the law of the armed conflict.
That the military quickly began implementing the plan is a testament to his influence in the Israeli defense establishment.
Eran Etzion was deputy head of Israel's National Security Council until 2008.
The ousted Defense Minister Gallant denied on camera that the government is actually implementing this plan. Netanyahu denied it also in a closed session with Secretary of State Blinken. And then, when asked by Blinken to say it publicly, Netanyahu refused.
Back in 2008, he wrote that in the event of another war with Lebanon, the suffering of hundreds of thousands of people are consequences that can influence Hezbollah's behavior. Israel's most recent offensive began with bombing, starting on October 7th. The ground invasion didn't begin until the 27th. This was accompanied by a further tightening of the siege, which had already been in place for some 17 years. Hassan Alian, head of Koget, the agency responsible for facilitating aid distribution, said plainly that these measures were revenge for October 7th.
مع هيك وحوش بشرية رايحين نتعامل كيف لازم. إسرائيل فرضت إغلاق كامل على غزة ومش راح يكون في عندكم كهرباء ولا مي بس دمار. بدكم جهنم راح تحصلوا على جهنم.
A sense of retribution and revenge must have fueled the other measures with regard to targeting. Yagil Levi, writing in Haaretz, challenges Israel's oft-repeated distinction as the world's most moral army. To reduce the risk even further during the ground offensive, air and artillery attacks preceded the entry of the ground forces into every area and accompanied them during the ensuing fighting. In the words of a reserve combat soldier who entered the city of Beit Hanun and published an opinion piece anonymously in Haaretz, the level of destruction we saw was biblical, and our contribution to it was nil. Air, artillery, and engineering forces that preceded us and hit buildings from a distance prepared the ground for us so that we could enter with minimal risks. As a result, as of October 7th, 2024, Israel had lost 349 soldiers in the ground operation. A paltry 2% of the Israeli claim of 17,000 Hamas combat casualties. As Levi points out, however, this was simply the number of men killed, according to Gaza's Ministry of Health. They had all been labeled combatants. The Ministry of Health's numbers are conservative, however. An analysis published in The Lancet and reported in the New York Times says they may have undercounted traumatic war-related deaths by 40%. The number may have reached over 70,000 by the end of 2024. Worse yet, the analysis did not account for other war-related casualties such as deaths from malnutrition, waterborne illness, or the breakdown of the health system as the conflict progressed. That this could be called a war is patently absurd. Israeli leaders have made their targeting and punishment of the civilian population known with their widely reported statements. Already by June of 2024, some 70,000 tons of bombs were dropped on a piece of land less than half the size of New York City. That number is more than were dropped on Dresden, Hamburg, London in World War II. Combined, the massive destructive power, with 2,000-pound bombs being common, erased entire towns. Amos Harel, chief defense correspondent for Haaretz, went to Jabalia and took photos and reported that the town, previously home to 100,000 people, was gone. Others shared the same fate as described by Ahmad Tibi, one of the few Palestinian members of the Israeli Knesset. Entire towns, like Beit Hanun, Beit Lahia, and Jabalia, have been wiped off the face of the earth in bombings by the IDF. Cities comparable in population size to Herzliya and Dimona have been bombed into rubble. And the world, with its silence and its armaments and its material support, is supporting this. The media in Israel wobbles between total denial and depicting the actions as heroic, justified, essential deeds. We have arrived at an absurd rule. Nothing justifies October 7th, but in the name of October 7th, everything is justifiable. There is no security justification for such massive bombing. No military action can justify bombing helpless human beings or the eradication of Beit Lahia, Beit Hanun, and Jabalia from the face of the earth. This ethnic cleansing is reminiscent of the ethnic cleansing of 530 villages in 1948. In the Jewish-Israeli public, voices of protest and resistance are hardly audible. Israeli outlets reported on Netanyahu scuttling negotiations, and it was an open secret that he did so in order to placate his ministers. A hostage deal would cause his government to collapse, and so Israel was effectively being run by the government's most fanatical ministers. Israel's left wing was furious and made as much known. My impression was that, certainly not all, but many Israelis had had enough. Also a year after October 7th, the Israeli Democracy Institute released a report on the public mood. On ending the so-called war, it was only an even split among Israeli Jews. And not even really. Only 45% wanted an end, 43% didn't, and 12% were no help at all. Of course, the better part of all Palestinians wanted it to end, which added several percentage points to that camp. I wrongly believed the calls to end hostilities was a broad and popular movement among Israeli Jews. The protests were large and widely reported on, but they were far more partisan than I had realized. Worse yet, however, were the reasons that this sector of society had for ending the so-called war. A little more than half said for the safety of the hostages. This amounted to the most common reason. The second was because they could focus on another war with Lebanon. Then it was that the fighting achieved what it could, 9% didn't know why, and 6% because of the great cost in human life and the desire for quiet, peace, and security. And 2% said for improved relations with the U.S. Someone who's been grappling with Israeli society's moral decline has been Rachel Fink. She illustrates poignantly a personal crisis for her upon seeing Israeli news coverage showing desperate, starving people in Gaza. On Sunday evening, when Channel 12's main news broadcast featured some of the most gut-wrenching footage coming out of Gaza, hungry children clamoring around a soup ladle in desperation, I felt for a moment a sense of relief. Finally, I thought. Finally, an Israeli journalist has made the brave and morally virtuous choice to do his job, to report the truth. That feeling lasted right up until said journalist, Elad Simchayoff, began to speak. Because it turned out that this wasn't a segment about Israel's failure to uphold international law or protect civilian life. It was a report about Israel's failure to sell the war properly. Not a failure of policy, a failure of branding. As I watch, I experience a kind of emotional whiplash. Time and again, Simchayev starts a sentence that sounds like there might be a moral reckoning coming, and it ends with a plea for better PR. But it is also possible to wonder if perhaps it is time to improve our, Simchayev begins contemplatively, humanitarian policies, accountability, Hasbara efforts with skilled spokespeople, a clear and effective strategy and believable information, he declares. That's not a punchline, it's his game plan. For much of Simchayev's report, as his voice plays off camera, B-roll footage of starving Palestinians begging for flour and wandering through the rubble of pulverized buildings runs in a loop. When it cuts back to anchorwoman Yonit Levi, she sums up the segment with a single line. "Those are the images being shown to the world," she says, with clear disdain. How many different kinds of delusional do you have to be to air horrifying footage of human suffering beneath a voiceover lamenting the challenges of public relations? What does it say about a society when you can look at a child, sunken-eyed and silent with fear and grief, and decide the real injustice is that she's hogging the spotlight. We're now entering a third month of a complete and total blockade of all aid into Gaza. This includes food and medicine, everything. Nothing has been allowed into Gaza for months now. Additionally, back in April, Nir Hassan wrote that Gazans are experiencing a severe water shortage, which has worsened since approximately a week ago when the Israeli Defense Forces struck the main water pipeline into the Shujaa neighborhood of Gaza City. Because of damage to the city's other water sources, the pipeline provided about 70% of the water consumption there. Now, why does it matter that Israeli society is characterized by a culture of dehumanization? It matters because it contextualizes the issue, and it contextualizes Israel's treatment of Palestinians, as well as their dismissiveness of Palestinians and their suffering. Its real-world consequences are apparent in Yagia Levy's Haaretz piece. The revenge impulse, accompanied by the notion that no one in Gaza is innocent, meant that those whose lives are perceived as lacking in value were put at even higher risk and may even have led to the deliberate killing of civilians. A consequence of the fact that conscription into the military is mandatory in Israel, which blurs the lines between the public mood and that of the military.